Before I introduce to you our eminent speaker, let me express my thanks to the Richard Neutra Institute in Zurich, who is funding these yearly lectures. I'm delighted that they acted upon my suggestion to choose not Harvard, as they intended to do, but the University of California at Los Angeles. UCLA has since 20 years been custodian of the earlier portion of Richard Neutra's drawings, sketches, and correspondence in its special library collection. In 1969, UCLA conferred an honorary doctorate on my husband, which, seems to me, is enough reason to have this yearly event take place on this campus and in this city and state where Richard Neutra started his American career nearly half a century ago. I also want to thank Mrs. Pearl Letts of the Committee of Fine Arts Production and Public Lectures for the excellent preparation of this occasion. Permit me, at this first inaugural lecture, a few personal remarks. Since his early youth, Richard Neutra believed that the center of our planning should be man, woman, and child, with their sensory differences and needs considered and respected, as researched on by human biologists and physiologists. My husband coined a word for his belief, which he called biorealism. His definition of this term was the following: bios, the Greek word for life, comprises the infinitely manifold emotive powers of ourself. The word real refers to life, reality, and steers away from vague abstractions. His belief was that design of human environment, the housing of all human activities, including also rest and contemplation, is above all not a constructive and anorganic issue, but first of all a very human issue. He said, for instance, and I quote, "The structural appears as a sequel to the human, into which I wish to penetrate from the impressionistic, the physiognomic, intuitive side, and last but not least, from all the systematics of current physiological information. A failure herein would impair and imperil a project's biological realism, which is closest to my heart," unquote. Unfortunately, most architects are still only concerned with form, shape, structure, materials, or purely economic considerations, mostly unaware what importance the impact of our environment has on our well-being, as proven by the researches of the natural scientists. They, in turn, are again largely unaware that their researches have any bearing on architecture, engineering, or city planning. All during his life, Richard Neutra tried, through his writings, through illustrated lectures he was invited to give all over the world, to explain this concern of his. But for so many decades he was a crier in the wilderness. So you can imagine how happy he was when, already nearly 10 years ago, after Dr. Dubos had read his most important book, Survival Through Design, in which he tries to give a scientific basis for design, he wrote him the following letter, and I quote from it: "Allow me to tell you how much I admire your concern for the need to develop a science of living man. Unfortunately, the questions which you raise are never discussed either in schools of medicine or public health and are ignored by biological research institutes. I hope your voice will reach beyond the world of architecture and urban planners and help biologists escape from the shackles of reductionism. As you have stated so eloquently, the most urgent problem today is knowledge of the manner in which man responds to the technological world he is creating," unquote. We are therefore delighted that Professor Dubos has accepted the invitation to be the first lecturer for this inaugural address. It is our hope that this lecture and subsequent ones will open the eyes and throw a bridge between the architects, engineers, general public, and the natural scientists. I also would like to mention how happy I am that my two sons are interested to carry on their father's ideas. Raymond Neutra, physician and epidemiologist, can see how the concept of biorealism has an application also in his field of medicine. While my son Dion, the architect who continues the father-son practice, has just completed a $5 million library design in his father's memory, incorporating, developing, and implementing biorealistic ideas. It is a red letter day for his family. That groundbreaking will take place this Saturday in Huntington Beach. How happy his father would have been at this occasion. We are all delighted that Professor Dubos has agreed to be present and say a few words at this occasion. But now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Rene Dubos has received so many honors, has had a life so full of accomplishments that I could not possibly relate them fully here. So let me mention only the most important facts, especially relevant to this lecture. Rene Dubos was born 1901 and educated in France. He completed his work for a PhD in 1927 at Rutgers University in the field of microbiology. The same year, he joined the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now the Rockefeller University. He was George Fabian Professor of Comparative Pathology and Professor of Tropical Medicine at the Harvard University Medical School for 3 years. Then returned to the Rockefeller University in 1945, where he has remained ever since and is now Professor Emeritus. For his scientific contributions, Dr. Dubos received more than 15 awards, of which I would like to mention at least a few, namely the Modern Medicine Award for Distinguished Achievement in 1961, the Phi Beta Kappa Award for his books The Unseen World in 1963 and Man Adapting in 1965, the American Medical Association Award in 1964, the 1969 Pulitzer Prize for So Human an Animal, and the Harold Terry Clark Award in 1970. Most of his professional life has been in laboratory work. He first dealt primarily with the mechanisms of resistance to infectious diseases. Then he turned his attention to the lasting effects of early environmental influences on physical and mental development, a field for which he suggested the expression biological Freudianism. His interest in the biological and mental effects of the total environment have led him to become involved in the socio-medical problems of underprivileged communities, as well as in those created by economic affluence in industrialized countries. In this regard, he has particularly emphasized the part played by so-called influences, i.e., the environmental factor that impinge on the developing organism during the prenatal and early postnatal period. These early influences have effects that affect biological and mental characteristics throughout the whole lifespan. It may even extend into the following generations. The lasting effects of early environmental influences can be studied in the laboratory. During the past few years, Dr. Dubos has developed a number of experimental models that reproduce in animals some of the lasting effects of early influences observed in human beings. For this reason, he has advocated the development of new research facilities designed to observe animals under a variety of environmental conditions for prolonged periods of time, an idea which was close to the heart of Richard Neutra. Increasingly, during the past 20 years, he has emphasized the medical, behavioral, and social consequences of life in the modern urban industrial world. This has led him to concern himself with the qualities of the total environment and thus to approach from a purely biological point of view the very problem of environmental design which were at the center of Richard Neutra's preoccupations. Rene Dubos has presented his views concerning environmental biomedicine in several books, and I mention just a few: Mirage of Health, Man Adapting, Man, Medicine and Environment, So Human and Animal, Only on Earth, The Care and Maintenance of a Small Planet, prepared with Barbara Ward for the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm this year. In A God Within, published in September 1972, he discusses the evolutionary and experimental aspects of human life which provide a biological basis for environmental design. Dr. Dubos, following the lecture, there will be a question and answer period. Professor Heinz will assist Dr. Dubos in recognizing the questioner, who will then be given a microphone by an usher. I present to you, in the first Richard Neutra Memorial Lecture, Dr. Rene Dubos, who titles his lecture Shelters, Open Spaces, and Adaptations. Thank you.
Mrs. Neutra, ladies and gentlemen, I wish that 10 years ago, when I wrote the letter which I had forgotten, but which Mrs. Neutra read a few minutes ago, I had known the story with which I intend to begin this lecture. Because this story, I believe, even though it is 100 years old, would have been of very meaningful to Richard Neutra. The story concerns the illustrious French scientist, chemist, biologist, and later medical scientist, Louis Pasteur. In 1864, Pasteur was invited to act as professor at the School of the Fine Arts in Paris, at the École des Beaux-Arts. Very few persons know that, even in France. And in fact, the lectures that he delivered there have not been published, but I have had access to the notes which he prepared for the lectures. And in these lectures, Pasteur was invited to discuss physics, chemistry, and physiology for students in the fine arts. In fact, he has extremely interesting things to say about the applications of chemistry and physiology to the art of painting, but he has even more interesting things to say about the applications of physiology to the design of buildings. So that in reality, in these lectures given between 1864 and 1867, Pasteur tried to do for the first time that to which Richard Neutra devoted so much energy. How can we introduce physiological thinking in the design of buildings? I cannot take the time today to describe to you the experiments which he carried out on this occasion, and which illustrated very clearly that one of the great difficulties in designing buildings is that human beings have a tendency to adapt as they think, even to bad conditions, which means not true adaptation, but rather coming to accept bad conditions. But the only aspect of this historical event which I want to mention this evening is that these lectures lasted only 3 years, from 1864 to 1867. Then Pasteur went on to other scientific activities, and no effort was made to replace him. Now, certainly, it was not for lack of scientists who had the kind of knowledge that could have helped the students in architecture, in the fine arts in Paris, to approach their problem with a somewhat more scientific understanding of the technical aspect of their problems. It was simply that then, as now, the tendency was to regard architecture only as a form of art concerned with form, shape, at the most construction techniques, without giving much thought to the physiological aspects of the art of design. And this is precisely, of course, the problem which Richard Neutra had to face for a long time. The indifference of the profession toward the fact that architecture is not only form, architecture is fitting the forms to fundamental human needs. As we all know, Neutra was, on the whole, fairly successful in beginning to sensitize the architectural profession to the need of introducing physiological concerns into design. And he pointed out that practically all aspects of design, from the shape of the rooms to their color, to their texture, had physiological determinants. I could not possibly this evening discuss all these aspects of the relation between biology and architecture. Rather, I will select two aspects that appear limited, but which, as you will see, encompass the totality of man's relation to his environment. And these two aspects, as it turns out, were clearly and really very forcefully stated by Richard Neutra on two occasions. One of them was in his famous book, Survival Through Design, in which he emphasized that the architect must deal, of course, with physical arrangements, but the effectiveness of these arrangements is due to the organic response of human beings, and this organic response has been molded millions of years earlier. Now, this may sound a very strange statement to you, but as you will see, this will be the key of my own presentation. That practically all our needs, our fundamental needs, emerged in the course of human evolution millions of years ago and have not significantly changed. Then the other statement, around which I shall speak was in an essay which perhaps has not been published, entitled Epilogue on an Architect's Life, in which there is this phrase: our great theme is the individual, not lost in the shuffle, not regimented. In other words, the design must fit the needs of the individual person. And after reading those two phrases, I believe that I can help you to understand the complexity of the problem, because on the one hand, architectural design must concern itself with those physiological needs of the human being which occur throughout the human species, which are universal, and at the same time, design must take into account the peculiarities of each individual person. If I were to try to summarize right now my presentation, it would be by affirming my conviction that all successful architectural designs throughout history have been those which have met unchangeable needs of human beings, common to the whole human species, but have met them within the constraints imposed by contemporary culture, local conditions, and individual desires. Now, after these abstract statements, let me attempt to illustrate them for you with a few examples. But first, perhaps, since I'm going to be speaking a great deal about homes, I should try to make clear to you how, as a professional biologist, I see a very fundamental difference between habitat as designed for animal life and homes as designed for human life. All over the earth, animals are adapted through biological transformation to the particular conditions of their environment. The animal's physiological and anatomical structure have evolved in such a manner that they fit the specialized environmental conditions under which the animal lives. And this is the animal habitat, something achieved through the blind operations of evolutionary adaptation. Now look at man. Man, from this point of view, has a very narrow habitat. Physiologically, he's adapted to live under very narrow conditions, highly specialized. His biological habitat is extremely small. But on the other hand, man has learned to adapt the environment to his desires. Man always lives in artificial environments. From the beginning of time, man has created artificial conditions to fit his needs. And it is because he has been capable of modifying the environment through social adaptations instead of biological adaptations that he has been able to establish himself all over the earth. And it is those social adaptations peculiar to each group of people, as I shall illustrate later, peculiar for that matter to each person. These adaptations are at the origin of what we call homes. Now, I said adaptations peculiar to each group of people. Let me give you just two examples to illustrate how effective those social adaptations can be. Just think for a few minutes of western New Mexico, an area fairly well defined with regard to geologic and climatic characteristics. And yet, in this particular region, there live 5 very different kind of people, each with its own ways of life, each with its own environments, each with its own type of homes, namely the Navajos living a pastoral life in their hogans, the Zunis living in the Hopi type of village, the Mormons with their types of farms, the Mexican Catholics, and the Texas Rangers. All these 5 different people with profoundly different kinds of relation to the world around them have managed to live successfully under the scorching sun of New Mexico, but each, if I may say, listening to the beat of a different kind of cultural drum. If you want another example, and then from then on I'll leave it up to you to think of many others, just think of the Pacific Islands, all of them with about the same climate, all of them with about the same resources, all of them with about the same geology. And yet, just imagine how profoundly different life is in Hawaii from what it is in Fiji, from what it is in Tahiti. Hawaii having received the American influence, Fiji the British influence, and Tahiti the French influence. Here we see once more man shaping the environment to fit certain types of cultural domains. Now, these examples, I hope, will help you to visualize what I mean when I speak of human needs and human wants. Human needs are all those needs that all human beings share in common and that have to be satisfied. Human wants are all those desires peculiar to a given society, peculiar to a particular person, which make that society and that person satisfy the needs according to certain patterns which vary from society to society, from person to person. And the variety, the diversity of those social wants is really incredible. However, what is clear is that no social want can lead to a viable form of civilization unless it is compatible with the unchangeable and universal human biological needs. I have used the word unchangeable and universal. I have used them because I know as a biologist, and I'm sure every professional biologist in this room would agree with me, that the genetic endowment of the human race has not changed for at least 30,000 years, and probably for much longer time than that. Certainly man today is biologically no different at all from what he was during the Stone Age. And because our genetic endowment has not changed, our fundamental needs are still exactly the same as those of Stone Age man. The only thing that has changed is that we have found different ways of satisfying those unchangeable needs. And this is precisely where all forms of planning, all forms of art, and architecture in particular play such an enormous role, is that under each type of condition, they try to find formula which fit these unchangeable needs. The best I can do in the few minutes that we shall spend together is that I select a few illustrations that I shall present by necessity in a dogmatic manner, often in a superficial manner, to illustrate this permanence of fundamental need and the diversity of satisfaction of these needs. Consider, for example, the design of shelters. From the beginning of time, men, of course, have constructed shelters or have used natural shelters. In a cold environment in the distant past, man would seek shelter in a natural cave, in a tropical country. He would create some kind of dwelling that would afford him with the proper kind of aeration. But whatever the nature of the dwelling used by man, whether tropical man or whether man in Los Angeles today, what has to be satisfied is certain temperature requirements. Now that sounds very trivial, as you probably think. And moreover, you immediately probably believe, well, there is one case where there are differences among human beings, but there are no differences. If there is one thing that physiology has demonstrated, is that the Eskimo, as well as man in the temperate countries, as well as man in the tropics, has exactly the same kind of needs with regard to environmental temperature. The Eskimo living in the Arctic lives at exactly the same temperature that you do in Los Angeles. There are exquisite measurements of that which demonstrate that the Eskimos have developed the kind of social adaptation in the form of their type of clothing, in the form of their snow houses, that permits them always to live at the temperature at which you live. To such an extent that the famous explorer Stephenson, a few years ago, after spending 3 years living among the Eskimos, wrote a book, one very accurate from the physiological point of view, a book entitled The Tropical Life of the Eskimos. And he used the word tropical because we are all tropical people wherever we live. Wherever we live, we try to maintain around ourselves an environment which mimics the climatic conditions that prevailed on the plateau of East Africa, where man emerged probably a million years ago. Now, for a long time, the architects or the builders tried to satisfy these needs by devising some kind of construction that made it easier for man to keep himself at the proper temperature. And as you all know, the easiest technique until our time was to build dwellings with tremendous thick walls, either of stone or of adobe, depending upon local conditions. At the present time, of course, we can escape from this because we have air conditioning. And by the way, wherever human beings air condition their homes, whatever the color of their skin, wherever they were born, they air conditioned their rooms at just about the same temperature, indicating the universality of our temperature requirements. May I say in passing that I think the air conditioning technology, helpful as it is still extremely primitive because it fails to take into account another aspect of man's physiological needs that only a few physiologists have come to recognize clearly. Namely, I said that our temperature, body temperature, is the same for all human beings all over the world, and it was true. But I should have said also that the temperature of a particular human being is not constant. Your body temperature is not the same at night as what it is during the day. There are diurnal cycles, rhythms of temperature. Your body temperature is not quite the same in the winter as what it is in the summer, even though you are placed under the same constant, well-regulated, air-conditioned rooms. There are seasonal cycles which are, so to speak, imprinted in our biological constitution and that we cannot escape. And my personal feeling is that when air conditioning becomes really sophisticated physiologically, it will learn to maintain temperature not only at the constant 70, 75 that we are taught to accept as normal today, but rather with a cycle that corresponds to the body cycles, to those cycles that men have experienced since the beginning of time. Now let me go to another problem about which I have nothing to say. And I selected precisely because I have nothing to say. All architects, all designers are rightfully concerned with the size of the room, the shape of the room, the color of the room. And they would like to hear from human biologists what are the sizes, the shapes, and the colors that are best suited to human beings. These are very legitimate questions. And they were probably the questions that I had in mind 10 years ago when I wrote to Richard Neutra the letter that Mrs. Neutra quoted a while ago. And when I said, unfortunately, physiologists do not ask that kind of question. They must be told that they have to study these problems to help the builders design the proper kind of room. The only thing that I can say is that as I have looked over the history of building, I have discovered that there have been many different kinds of shapes and colors and sizes. I have a feeling that the first rooms built by men were round. There have been lots of octagonal rooms, lots of hexagonal rooms, until we came to the present kind of room, more or less standardized in shape and in size. So I have a feeling that there is no very absolute criterion to satisfy physiologically a human being with regard to shape and size. My suspicion, and I say my suspicion only to point to an area of ignorance, is that we are extremely conditioned by cultural forces with regard to the design of our rooms. And I had occasion some time ago to read a historical study of the evolution of the size of rooms in Eastern Ireland over some 300 or 400 years, and showing a study which shows how profoundly and rapidly the shape of room has changed as the ways of life of people change. So there does not seem to be anything very constant there, rather some response to some social force. And I leave it as vague as that because I do not believe that more is known, or at least I do not know it. But there is one aspect where a fair amount is known, and which points very clearly to the importance of social conditioning. I'm sure that many of you have become interested in psychological factors of relation of one person to the other, and that many of you are familiar with the phrase the space bubble, that kind of area which we want to reserve for ourselves, and within which we consider the presence of another person as entering, so to speak, our private property, the space bubble, a phrase I believe that was introduced by Edwin Hall some 10 years ago. Now, what is remarkable about that space bubble, the size of the space which we consider our own, is that it is very characteristic of a culture. As soon as I say it, even if you are not at all familiar with this problem, you will know what I'm speaking about. If you belong to the English culture or the Scandinavian culture, you want to have a space bubble that big. If somebody comes closer than that to you, that's bad taste. If you belong to the Mediterranean culture, Greek or Arab or south of France, if people keep that far away from you, that means that they behave as if they were your enemies or dislike you. What they want is to be very close to you. The space bubble is very small for Mediterranean people, very large for Anglo-Saxon people. And as you certainly know, most Nordic people in England, Scandinavia, in this country to a large extent, consider that this close contact which the Arabs or the Greeks or the Southern French consider proper social behavior is obnoxious, bad taste. And because of this, in the design of room, one has had to take into account the size of the space bubble. Now, I'm convinced that we are not dealing here with a fundamental biological trait of human being, but rather with a kind of social conditioning that we acquire very early in life. And I, coming from a Mediterranean country, I'm inclined to believe that the Greeks and the Arabs and the people from the south of France are right and the Scandinavian wrong. And in case you do not believe me, I will remind you of the fact that it is precisely in those countries, Scandinavia, England, and in part this country, where the space bubble officially is so big, that there has been the strongest reaction against this practice among the young people during the past few years. So my feeling is that the young people are rediscovering the biological wisdom of the Mediterranean world. Now let me introduce another of those social conditioning, forms of social conditioning, which is of immense importance in designing environments. And here I shall tell it in the form of an account given by a Norwegian who was for many years director of the Museum of Natural History in New York. His name is Parr, P-A-R-R. If I mention that he was director of the Museum of Natural History, it's to make clear to you that he's a very sophisticated person. Mr. Parr was raised in Norway up to the age of 18 or 20. And he has described in extraordinary perceptive articles what was life in a small Norwegian town at the turn of the century. At that time, there was no electricity. There was no central heating. There was gas light or acetylene light, and then a fire or a stove in one room. Now this has enormous social consequences, because that means that during a cold Norwegian evening, and most evenings in Norway are cold and dark, the whole family had to be in one room. And since the children could not be trusted with a gas light or acetylene light, they had to sit around the family table, a round table, to do their homework, to play games, to engage in whatever activities they spent during the evening. The family circle, I'm sure, the phrase has this origin, that until our time, until the days of electricity, the whole family had to gather around the one single source of light that was safe, had to gather in the only room that could be heated. Now, I need not tell you that the necessity to gather and have activities all in the same room, around the same table, imposed all sorts of constraints, a kind of social discipline, which you may object to, but which also introduced a remarkable social coherence in the family group. Whereas the day when electricity comes in, that each kid can have his own room with his own switch and whatever light he wants when he wants it, and especially the day when each room can be individually heated, then this family circle breaks up with, as I believe, all sorts of social consequences that have not yet been clearly analyzed, going all the way to this ideal so beautifully expressed by Virginia Woolf in her book, A Room of One's Own, which has enormous social appeal for all of us, but which, as you probably know, has resulted in many cases in a kind of separation from the rest of the social group, often with sad results. It's not without interest that Virginia Woolf, gifted as she was, successful as she was, committed suicide 10 years after writing A Room of One's Own. So I have a feeling that in some way, in our design of rooms, of dwellings, we must manage to reintroduce some kind of social coherence, and how to do it will be a difficult problem for the modern architect, I'm sure. There would be so many other aspects of these fundamental needs of human beings that I wish to discuss. For example, the need of exploration. Now that does not sound very relevant to design of homes. And yet anyone who has lived in old establishments, in old cities, knows that all over the world, children, and for that matter, adults too, have a sort of desire for barns, attics, cellars, hiding places behind the stairs, and other unorthodox areas wherever these persons want to engage in activities of a personal character. Now, I'm sure that this preference for these hiding spots, so to speak, has a very fundamental biological basis. I believe it has its origin in some obscure instinct for adventure and for exploration. An instinct which is very difficult to satisfy in the modern kind of designs, as we all know. And for one, as a person who is still very close to the old world, and especially to the Mediterranean world, I have come to believe that the irregularity and the fantasy of ancient human settlements in the Mediterranean villages and towns attracts so many American and other European visitors who live in dwellings which are mechanically and biologically efficient. They attract them because all of us are looking for some kind of environment where there is something to explore, there is some kind of possible adventure. In this sense, we are not different from a young animal always looking for some kind of dark corner to explore. Well, now after speaking about shelters, let me speak about the need for open spaces. And let me remind you again that man emerged on the plateaus of East Africa in a land that was uncluttered with immense spaces, immense unobstructed views. And I believe that all of us have retained some kind of physiological need for this unobstructed view of an uncluttered world. If you could take the time, if we could take the time, I could provide endless illustrations of the fact that all landscape design, in the many forms that it has taken in the course of time, has been an attempt to satisfy, in part at least, this very fundamental need. Just to limit myself to two examples, I was raised in the north of France, an incredibly uninteresting, flat type of country as God made it. But where the French landscape architects have learned to create this sense of distance and of unobstructed views by opening those vistas through the forest. Any one of you who has traveled in France will know how those long open vistas through the trees gives the illusion that there is something very far to be seen, way, way beyond. This feeling, which is expressed by the beautiful poetical French phrase, the magic of infinite perspectives, la magie des perspectives infinies. And to make clear that I'm not saying that out of a chauvinistic attitude, the English, having to work under very similar physical conditions, have found another solution, completely different from that of the French, but fully as satisfactory, perhaps more satisfactory, namely opening those slopes completely clear of trees and ending on probably a body of water so that the vision can float over the grass and then float in a sort of infinite way on an open body of water, a sense of space satisfied by a technique completely different from that of the French solution, and of course very different from what we have here in the Western states, where nature has given us these extraordinary vistas. Hastily, let me move to another topic where design has to be instructed, if I may say, by knowledge of some fundamental needs of human relationships. The tribe, the hunting tribe of the Stone Age man was probably about 50 persons. And one knows that the mating community, the number of tribes which exchange males and females, was probably approximately 500 persons. So one can say that the Stone Age biological unit was 500, 300 to 1,000 persons. When the agricultural revolution came in 10,000 years ago, villages appeared, and it is a remarkable thing that all over the world, the average farming village is 500 persons. Most of Europe was still made up of 500 persons villages until our times. And even today, when we think of India, you probably think of those enormous anonymous cities like Calcutta, but the plain truth is that today there are in India 675,000 villages of about 500 people average. So this is the social unit to which we are adapted. And I have no doubt that in our organization of cities, we have to learn to reconstruct this kind of neighborhood. When sufficiently large that there is enough diversity of population, when sufficiently small, not that we know everybody in it, not that we like everybody in it, but that we know what to expect of them, that we know them sufficiently, that we know what kind of responses they will make, that we will not treat them as strangers. And by the way, as if you look in all the cities of the world at the present time, huge as they become, along with their increase in size, there is the effort, even in New York City, in reconstructing these neighborhoods. The neighborhood has the fundamental biological unit of social relationship. But along with this need for the neighborhood spirit, there seems to have existed in mankind from the beginning of time also the need for occasions where much larger groups of people would gather together. One knows now that huge megalithic monuments like Stonehenge or Karnak were places where immense groups of people gathered from all the Stone Age civilization, so to speak, to engage in communal ceremonies. We know that all the great religious ceremonies of the Middle Ages involved tremendous numbers of people. And in our times, don't we know that there is that need of sharing all the great communal experiences, whether it is the celebration of peace, whether it's getting together to mourn a person like President Kennedy, whether it is to celebrate an event like the moon landing. Just imagine, it's so much easier to look at the moon landing in your home on your own television set, and the fact is that hundreds of thousands of persons gathered in Central Park in New York City or in all the cities of the world to share together this extraordinary experience. Well, in my opinion, we have to learn to reintroduce in our social planning places where we can collectively share these great experiences. So that I would, if I had time, extend for you the meaning of the word monument. The word monument does not mean only some very pretentious building. It means especially a place, a situation where all of us can get together to share together something which makes our community an essentially functioning, unifying biological structure. And since I speak of these environments where we share things together, I have to come back to this extraordinary contrast which I have evoked on several occasions. On the one hand, the biological uniformity of all of mankind. On the other hand, the need for each one of us to achieve some kind of individual expression. The fact is, the paradox, if I may say, is that all our fundamental characteristics are the same for all human beings. But on the other hand, each and every one of us is biologically different. We are genetically different in details, but important details, important for our private life. We are different in our past experiences, so that one can say that each person is unique, unprecedented, and I believe unrepeatable. We are, each one of us, one of a kind. And now out of that, there does exist in every human being the need to express this individuality. Now that presents a tremendous problem for the planner, because in some way it looks as if he had to design for each individual person a different kind of environment in which that person can express himself. Because I should say that we never succeed in expressing our potentialities unless we find ourselves in the kind of environment that makes it possible for our genetic endowment to existentialize itself. We may have all the potentialities of the world, they do not become expressed unless we are placed under the right conditions. Well, now, obviously, the planner cannot do that. But what he can do is to create in the environment that he organizes sufficient diversity so that there are a multiplicity of options among which each one of us can select to act out, if I may say, a life of his own choice. And I think this is especially of immense importance for the development of children. There must be enough diversity of environment for children to select that which fits their special nature best, so that they can give expression to their potentialities and discover what they want to become and become what they want to become. So I'm convinced that we will have to introduce in design much more diversity than we have done, especially in American cities. I think from this point of view, American cities are far worse than most cities of the world. I'm aware that introducing diversity introduces complications, increases costs, decreases efficiency of operation. But I'm also convinced that diversity is vastly more important than efficiency, because it's out of the diversity of option that we can give to more human beings the occasion to express themselves, to become what they are potentially capable of becoming, instead of being like everybody else. And this gives me the occasion to end on a word which I hope will be meaningful to you in the light of what has been said before, namely that planning demands that we build stages. Now let me convey to you through my personal experience why I use the word stage. I happen to be active in the affairs of the Parks Council in New York City. And like my well-meaning colleagues, I thought the important thing was to create more parks with more beautiful trees, with more meadows, accessible to the citizens of New York. When several members of the minority groups told us, well, really, what you want is to do something that you like. But that doesn't mean that this is what we want. And one of them said, what we want is stages. And I was a bit disturbed by the statement until I realized that what he meant was something very profound. That depending upon your past, depending upon your experience, depending upon your aspirations, depending upon the social group of which you are a part, what you want is a place, a stage, in which to act out, to give expression to that which you consider the truest form of your own being, or of the being of the group of which you are a part. We must learn to create stages for every kind of human being to act out his own life the way he wants to define it. And this gives me an occasion, since the time has come to end, to return to Richard Neutra, because in reality, this is deeply what he had in mind in that sentence that I read at the beginning of my presentation. Our great theme is the individual, not regimented. What we must do is to create conditions so that each individual can discover himself, express himself, create himself. And this would be a hopeless plea if it were not for the fact that there do exist all those very fundamental needs of human beings common to all of us. But these fundamental needs can be expressed in many different ways. And these many different ways depend upon each and every one of you to try to formulate them, and depend upon the artist, the architect in this case, the planner, to give it a form which is compatible with human aspirations and with practical constraints. So if I were to end, it would be only to restate what I said at the beginning. My conviction is that each period, each artist provides a particular adaptive response, social adaptive response, to unchangeable biological needs of human beings. And the role of the architect, of the planner, is to provide this adaptive response within a contemporary context and within the constraints imposed by local conditions. Thank you.
If you will raise your hand, I will attempt to recognize as many people as possible in all parts of the hall. Yes, here. Would the usher bring a microphone?
Is it on? Can you hear me? Oh. What do you think of the idea of having what I think of as playpens for grown-ups? That would be playgrounds that would be built as part of every building in which people gathered. Hospitals, schools, civic buildings, so that on their lunch hours and during periodic breaks, people could go out and enjoy their sensual natures.
What do I think about it? Well, let me answer in a very simple, personal way. As some of you may know, I spent 13 years of my life in Paris, a few years in Rome, and the great superiority of these two cities, and they really have superiorities, even though in many respects they are uncomfortable, is precisely that almost at every block there is some kind of situation, or rather I should say a variety of different situations throughout the city where each person can engage in this kind of game of which you speak. And instead of answering in the vague, let me talk about myself. I was born in a very poor environment. On the east, I was raised in a poor environment on the east side of Paris. Came from a very poor family. I know if I had been raised in a similar environment in New York City, that my life would have been probably miserable, and I would never have been able to break from the cage in which I had been raised. But in Paris, within 5 minutes walk, I could go to one of those public squares where I could see all of life going on publicly. 15 minutes walk, I could reach small kinds of parks along the river where during the day the mothers would come with their children, the old people would come and engage in whatever game they would care to engage, and come sundown, all young people would come and engage in the games of love in which they seem to be most interested. Then, not so far away, there were, let's say, parks where very elegant people would come, engage in another kind of rather pretentious game, but very entertaining to watch and at times to participate in. That was part of my education. And then there was the Luxembourg Garden, where I went as a student and where all young people engaged in those fantastically excited, even though often empty, political discussion, philosophical discussion, and whatever goes with it when young men and women are together. All this was really my great education in Paris, which I completed in Rome. Now, I do hope that we manage to reintroduce this in American life.
Dr. Dubois, you spoke about the importance of meeting man's basic, what you call fundamental needs, and also his individual unique needs. And I'm wondering if we're not able to do this, if designers, if planners, if architects, if in the development of our cities and our centers we're not able to do this, will this have any realistic or serious negative biological or psychological effects on the human being?
You know, it's not that I didn't hear you, the voice became a bit distorted. So I'll answer as if I had understood your question. And by the way, if it does not, but it was something that I intended to say anyhow, so it gives me an occasion to say it. See, I think we can very profoundly change the nature, not the nature of human beings, the expression of the nature of human beings by the kind of planning and of design in which we engage. Now, consider this. If you go to a country like Guatemala, most children are small, most adults are small, and there is a kind of lethargic behavior in the population that we tend to regard as an expression of the Indian Latin nature. Now, the same kind of people, born and raised on this side of the border, anywhere in the United States, the children will be large, the adults will look like us and behave like us. I think I know what's the origin of the difference. I do not want to take the time to elaborate on it here, but what I must say is that the difference is not one in the genetic of people. They are the same there as we are in all important aspects. The difference is the totality of the social environment. Now, you may, of course, properly speak about nutrition, infection, other medical aspects of the problem, but there are things that are even more important, I believe. If you live in a village in Guatemala, for example, as I have seen, the range of experience of a child is incredibly small, very narrow. It looks like a peaceful environment, but it's one that does not demand the kind of constructive, formative responses which give to young people the occasion to express that which they are potentially capable of expressing. Now, this is an extreme difference between the Guatemalan child and the American child. But I think it's one that applies all over the world. The fact is that if English people behave differently from the French or from the Italian or from the Greek or from the American, it is not because we are different. It is because the total social structure, including the way children are handled, the kind of playgrounds we design. I wish I could talk about playgrounds at greater length, by the way, of immense importance. The playgrounds, the kind of human relationship. What is it that's expected of the teenager at the time when he's sufficiently developed to engage in responsible activities? All this completely transforms people. So I have no doubt that the person who designs a building, the person who plans a city, in a way, cannot escape changing people, transforming people. It's a fantastic responsibility, but it's one which one must accept because we do it anyhow. And we do it, if we do it without thinking about it, we can, I believe, impoverish human life. Just one word about playgrounds, since I mentioned the word. As you certainly know, the Swedes, and recently the English, but the Swedes first, have been very much concerned with trying to define what is a good playground for a child. Let me again once more speak of personal experience. New York City is full of playgrounds, of course, but New York City is also full of vacant lots which remain vacant often for months and years. And where do you suppose the children play? They are bored to death in the playground and have a wonderful time in the vacant lots. For good reasons, because in the vacant lot, they can create their own world. In the standard playground, they have to do what you, the adult, want them to do. Now, the Swedes have developed those so-called adventure playgrounds that many of you probably know. Adventure playground being situations where almost everything is to be done. The only thing that's there is things for the children to do what they want with, even at times in a dangerous manner. And the important thing of one of those playgrounds is that no adult be in sight, even though that may result in some trouble. Well, the English have taken that over and are beginning to learn to standardize it. And in New York City, I know of several such. Certainly the standardized playground that we impose on children goes absolutely counter to something which is very fundamental in human nature, the need, especially in young animals and young human beings, the need to explore, the need to construct one's world, the need to imagine one's world. And here I shall quote a phrase of Shelley in the defense of poetry, which has always seemed to me such a wonderful biological expression of a profound biological law. We want the faculty to imagine that which we know. And he used the word imagine in its strong etymological sense, to construct images out of the few facts that we know, to construct something mentally, and then to try to realize it with stones and sticks and whatever is available. And I believe it's through this constant play between the mental imagining, the creation of images, and the creation of objects out of what is available to you, that we develop our potentialities, we discover ourselves, we enrich our life, and I believe we enrich civilization.
Dr. Dubos, you have talked about the importance of planning, and you've also talked about the importance of environment. Another noted author and scholar, Dr. B.F. Skinner, has also talked about the impact of environment on man, and in fact, I think he decries the role of individuality. I wonder, in the light of some of the things you yourself have written, whether you believe that we know enough about the outcome of planning in long-range terms to be able to engage in it with impunity at this time.
Well, as you know, Professor Skinner is a professional psychologist, whereas I'm a person who is interested in human beings. It makes very different attitude. Now, Professor Skinner, with his immense knowledge and professional skill, is convinced, and I'm not sure, he's convinced that he can manipulate human beings, shape them. I'll tell you why I'm sure. I'll tell you why I'm not sure that he can do it as well as he can, and then I'll come to my own view. Professor Skinner, I suspect if there are professional psychologists in this room, they belong to Professor Skinner's school and will consider me a very amateurish person. Well, Professor Skinner has developed those very powerful techniques which we all know about conditioning people. But I think what has never been quite proven is to what extent one can condition people. Professor Skinner does not believe in free will, as we know. He believes in complete conditioning. I happen to share the views of one of the most illustrious colleagues of Professor Skinner at Harvard, namely George Wald, a Nobel laureate of the Harvard Department of Biology, who tells this story. It's about the Harvard law of animal behavior, and I'm sure he has Professor Skinner in mind when he pronounces this law. Say, after you have conditioned the animal as carefully as you can with all the best techniques you know, in the end, the animal does as the damn pleases. Well, I believe that's what happens to human beings too, so much about planning. Now you asked about the distant consequences. Well, I certainly do not believe we know enough for planning, because the second order consequences of any large-scale planning are so complex, as we all know. And it is because I have all this in mind that I have looked for an intellectual escape, and I am aware that it is an escape, but I believe I have stated it as forcefully as I know how to state it. What I plead for is that we give in the environment a multiplicity of options, great diversity, so that each and every person including each and every child, has a better chance to select that which seems to fit him best, not only to fit best his innate characteristics, but also his aspirations, so that at least we give to each person a better chance to become what he wants to become. And since that will certainly result, and does result under normal conditions, in an immense variety of expressions of human potentialities, I think it introduces this kind of variety, which all ecologists know to be the safest safeguard against disasters. If there are many of us having very different kinds of skills, wanting to do all sorts of different kind of things, shape our cities differently so that one square is this way, another street in some other way, provided it is compatible with those fundamental biological laws of which I speak. I think we may get into trouble, yes, we may get into some lack of efficiency, yes, but I think in the long run we'll be safer, we'll have a world which is more interesting, and in some way we will do what human beings have done fairly successfully for the past million years, make life interesting.
Dr. Dubos, can you discuss to what extent laws affect or impede the topics that you're touching on tonight?
Do you think that needs discussion? Well, if it's, I really don't want to spend time on it. Not that I don't want to express an opinion, but it seems to me plainly obvious that both in the design and practice of war and the training of human beings for it, one goes counter everything that I have been pleading for. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you said war. Well, anyway, it gave me an occasion to say what I believe about war. Well, I had never dealt with the law in any way, neither did the law have to deal with me, fortunately, until the past 2 or 3 years. So I cannot answer in the abstract. I'm going to answer in terms of things that I've been engaged in. I happen to be very active in an organization in New York which is called the Natural Resource Defense Council. The Natural Resource Defense Council is made up of a group of very good lawyers who have made it their business to try to come to the help of citizens who feel that their fundamental rights with regard to the environment is being neglected or attacked. My only role in this, not knowing anything of the law, is to act as a sort of advisor and give whatever experience and wisdom I have. And what has impressed me is how powerful, if you know how to use the law, how powerful even our defective laws can be toward shaping a better environment. And I'll mention just one example. It's the last one that I heard. I can give you the reference to it. It has just been published. It has to do with an army camp, a very large army camp called Camp Smith, along the Hudson, about 50 miles north of New York. The army decided, in their wisdom, that they would fill in some of the wetlands with all sorts of junk to the wetlands adjacent to the Hudson to make a large parking area out of it. Now, no one would dare stop the Army from building another parking lot for their trucks, but apparently the citizens of Peekskill, New York, happened to like their wetland, but didn't hope that they could stop the Army from doing it. Yet they approached a lawyer who was the founder of that Nature Defense Research Council, whether anything could be done about it. And this is what was done within the law in a very peculiar way. Some biologists at the Boyce Thompson Institute, which is a biological institute south of New York, had made before some very profound, purely theoretical biological studies of that piece of wetland with regard to its fauna, its flora, and not only that, with regard to the transformation of organic matter that went on in that wetland, taking care of much of the pollution of the Hudson River for that area. See, what happened is that all the junk of the Hudson River has to go through that wetland. It's being processed, if I may say, by all the microbial life, plant life and animal life in the wetland, and in some way what emerges out of it is cleaner than what had gotten into it. Now, those people had the sense of figuring out how much would it cost to create a water purification plant that would be as effective as these wetlands were in cleaning the Hudson. And they found out, apparently with good documentation, that it would cost at least $100,000 a year to operate a plant, let alone what it would cost to build the water purification plant. So they went before the law saying, we, the citizens of Peekskill and whatever towns are downstream, are being damaged by the destruction of this plant, of this wetland area, and therefore something must be done to compensate for us. And apparently that had a very, it operated within the precedence of the law, so to speak. And the judge immediately passed on that the Army had been doing damage to the community and that the Army had to repair the situation, and within less than a year, all the wetland had been cleaned up of all the garbage and had been reseeded with the microbes and plants and animals. The communal good within the terms of the law, then the judge can act. But if you go to the judge and talk in terms of ecology or some such abstract concept, the judge does not find any way in the precedence to render a judgment, whatever his sympathy may be. So your question about the law is one way out of my competence, except for the fact that I do know that all over the country, oh, by the way, this NRD, the Natural Resource, NRDC, Natural Resource Defense Council, is opening an office. They are so successful in the New York area that they have opened an office in Palo Alto. And it's something that's emerging all over the country, and I believe it's beginning to be imitated over the rest of the world, that damage to the environment, if it can be stated in terms of damage done to the community in a form that's meaningful within the law can be acted on. So my belief is that we are going to see something very powerful and very new emerge in all our countries with regard to the use of the law for the protection of the communities.
I wondered if you might state your feelings about the innate quality of nature in relationship to man's needs. In other words, I think somewhere in your writings you talk about man really needing nature psychologically to be a well-balanced person.
If you find myself obscure in this answer, it's because my personal views are in the process of evolving. So let me answer with two components which appear to be contradictory, but I believe will be resolved. I stated, and will restate any time that I'm asked, that man still has exactly the same genetic equipment that he had when he emerged during Cro-Magnon, when he became Homo sapiens during Cro-Magnon time. And at that time, what emerged as man was a creature which was in constant interplay with the total environment. Constant interplay, for example, with open spaces, constant interplay with certain kinds of sounds, constant interplay with certain kind of fragrance, constant interplay with certain kinds of relationship with human being, constant interplay with, let's call it nature, if you will. And to the extent that this is removed from us, it corresponds to a mutilation, an impoverishment of our life. And I cannot see any more obvious illustration of it. And the fact that if you live in New York City or in any large city in the most comfortable, best appointed apartment where all your gross physical needs are satisfied in the way of temperature, food, any of the obvious needs that you have, just the same, you surround yourself with all sorts of, as one thought, useless things like animals, plants, a fire, wood fire, a chimney where to burn wood, and Lord knows what can be apparently more useless in New York City, as well as expensive, than doing that. And it's plainly obvious that through this, you are trying to, in my opinion, trying to recapture some of those very essential needs of which you are deprived in the artificial world that we create. It's obvious that for all of us, the migration, the exodus during the weekend to some form of country or seashore is an expression of the need to satisfy a very fundamental need which we cannot eliminate because it is woven in the fabric of our human constitution. So in a way, our relation to nature makes all those things which transcend the purely nutritional metabolic needs, makes these needs something as fundamentally as essential as the pure metabolic needs. So in a way we are a part of nature, and we are mutilated in some fundamental way when some of those satisfaction is, well, but it's more than satisfaction, it's a need which has been with us for at least 50,000 years. So there it is. I'm stating that we are part of nature. But on the other hand, I have during the past 2 years, and began in my last 2 books, but especially in the one that came out 2 weeks ago, A God Within, and will much more in the future, and in a series of articles that I'm publishing, express my increasing conviction that we never live in the wilderness. Man has never lived in the wilderness. We never live in nature. We have never lived in nature. If by the word nature you mean something untouched by man, wherever man is, he has transformed the environment. There is, to quote an English author, there is not one blade of grass in Great Britain which is God made. And this is true. This is true of France. This is true of a large part of this continent. Most of the temperate world used to be covered by forests and marshes, and man does not live in forests and marshes. He lives in open country. All the plants that he cultivates are sun-loving plants, not forest plants. So in a way, we change nature around us all the time. We do not live in nature. We live in man-made nature. So that appears to be contradictory, unless you believe, as I happen to believe, that when we change nature, when we manipulate it, what we are trying to do all the time is to recreate around ourselves the kind of environment under which we emerged, whenever it was, 1 million years ago, for the first time on the plateaus of East Africa, with its certain kind of climate, its certain kind of distribution of trees and open vistas, diversified landscape, something which is very close to the picture of paradise that we have reconstructed in all our paintings, in much of our literature, in all our myth. So, yes, we need nature, but we need the kind of nature under which we emerge, because I believe this is the only kind of nature in which we can physiologically function well. And to end on a crude image, but one which perhaps conveys better than anything else what I'm trying to say in such clumsy words, we may admire the desert, but we do not live in the desert unless we arrange a little bit of it to fit our needs, and those needs being those that we had acquired long ago. We don't live in the center of a dense forest. If you take pictures, as one can now very readily, of the Amazon forest, you know that if they are a human being, you see a clearing. Men are in the forest, yes, but where they live is a clearing where they have created something which is no longer the forest. So to summarize such a complex view, I believe that we mutilate ourselves whenever we remove from our lives some of the aspects of nature with which we evolved in a distant past, but on the other hand, we continuously modify nature to make it fit those fundamental needs that do not change.